This dynamic makes me feel like we're therapist client.
Which dynamic?
The way it feels on the camera with the seating, like the distance or something. Yeah, it's just the distance.
So those of you on YouTube might be able to see this, but Steph and I are trying to sit a little bit further away from our cameras because when I make our faces larger, our faces kind of fill the screen a little bit. And when we do reels and stuff for Instagram, I open my Instagram and there's just my giant face on the screen. It's really off-putting. And I don't know that people like, I don't know whether people like that or
Like
not.
scroll by it, like, oh, they're up in my face a lot.
Yeah.
But this feels like we're really far away.
Mm, does. Anyway, how does that make you feel, Steph?
Not sad, but it makes me feel disconnected.
Okay. Do you not feel sad when you feel disconnected?
I probably do, but it is a bit different because for me, we can talk about this too, but for me, the disconnection will become a guard that will front for sadness.
Okay.
I don't easily feel sad. It's my last resort.
It's my thirst, so this is going to be this is going to be one of those yin and yang conversations, which is
Yeah.
great because we cast a wide net when we have those.
Yeah.
For me, sadness is the most comfortable and safest emotion. I don't enjoy it, don't get me
Yeah.
wrong, but I would prefer to feel sad than angry. I would definitely prefer to feel sad than anxious, but I'm guessing you would prefer to be anxiously angry than sad.
I think prefer is a strange word. It's just that it's easier. It's just that it's like a path that I can go to without, familiarity is with it, comes with this for me. So sadness feels more threatening to me.
Okay.
I feel like when I get sad, that's gonna go, well, it's gonna go towards a collapse state, and I'd rather stay in fight or flight. I'd rather
Okay.
stay like "Blah," like doing that, even though I don't like it. It's not like it's like, but I suppose it's a bit of a preference.
Yeah, I think I'd rather collapse than be in fight or flight. And again, I know what you mean. It does seem strange to say rather, as in
Mm.
this is something that I would rather just be nicely
Yeah.
regulated, feeling okay, getting on with life. That's what I would rather. But I think for me, one of the reasons why, well, if I go way back, sadness, I think, was definitely the safest emotion at home.
Okay.
Anger there was no permission to be angry. Sadness would be more likely, I think, to elicit a compassionate response from my parents. So that might be more,
Mm-hmm.
go back to really early conditioning, just at the felt sense of this emotion, kind of feeling safe, even if I don't like it. It probably all begins there.
Well, how was sadness met for you? And also, was it met the same by both parents? This is maybe not podcast material, but like, what did sadness do for you? And what was the messaging between parents about that emotion?
I think more active emotions, say anger or even overexcitement, could be met with anger, would be met with anger,
Mm.
more anger than I could do. So anger never felt safe. And sadness, I think, would be more likely to elicit a softer response.
Okay.
Again, I think this is something that I don't want to like make this a women trait because I don't think it is, but I do think it can be seen a bit more often in women just because of how anger is presented as a not so feminine, or it's presented as hysteria as opposed to a valid. That there's this concept that for some people, women or not, when we might go to anger, we actually almost divert into sadness and it happens automatically. So something that for somebody else who's comfortable with their anger might make them feel angry, we might feel sad if that is our conditioning. And I've definitely seen that show up. So sometimes the injustices in the world rarely
Mm.
make me angry. I tend to feel sad about it
Mm.
because I feel that sense of, well, I see how anger can be such an amazing catalyst for change. And I think it's important for people to be angry at injustice. I guess when something is so far away and I feel like there's nothing that my anger is going to do, I would rather be holding sadness, or I feel safer processing that through sadness than through anger.
It's interesting because it's like, is there a right or wrong? It's probably maybe a balance equation because you and I have talked on this podcast about anger before, and I forget if you said it or if you conveyed it through someone else, and you said something like, that this idea that anger fronts for sadness, right? Like that anger is a defense rather against sadness. I disagree with that because I think anger is a separate emotion that has validity in and of itself. But I do also think that when it's our more comfortable emotion, and I think the same is also vice versa, that there can be affronting, there can be a defense in it, which is what I'm describing. I think that anger for me will become a defense for when I'm actually sad. So for me, it's been this lately, especially some kind of exploration of like, what is anger when it's purely that, and when that feels appropriate, where it is a catalyst for change. I have a client who describes it as like or her therapist describes it as anger illuminates a need for justice. And I think it's productive in that regard. But it can also then become a front for sadness, and again, vice versa. So it's like, how do I tell the difference between where anger is a useful and productive emotion versus when sadness actually is? And that's been coming up for me more lately since our discussions of it, and probably with more of my somatic therapy, where I'm actually noticing. I went away for training last week and I had confronted this a lot. When I sat through my activation of anger, because that's what we have to do in this course, in the training, I at the other side, I had tears in my eyes and I got sad. I got really sad in a number of instances. So there's this kind of like, how do we know when we're experiencing the emotion in its purest form versus when we're experiencing it as a front? Um, what?
It just feels like a huge question. How do we know? Yeah. It's almost like there might be signs in the body when you're doing your training, and it's so intentional to go and to look and to experience and to be open to whatever the experience is, then it's more likely to make itself known.
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's going to be
Yeah.
a
Yes,
clear
such a good point.
formula for that. And I just also want to say that I agree that sometimes sadness can be a front for anger, and anger can be a front for sadness. In transactional analysis, they talk about those as racket feelings. So they talk about them as feelings, as it's kind of spoken about it as if they're not quite authentic, which I don't really like that term, but I see what they're trying to say. It's more like a conditioned response
Mm.
than, I don't know, what's the alternative to that? Something that's more genuine, something that's more,
And what would it be? What would be more authentic?
well, it's going to depend on the situation.
I know, I'm just
Because
trying to think of like
some,
an example.
yeah, an
Because sadness
example.
and anger are such umbrellas. I mean, underneath that, there's nuances of those emotions, which I would consider maybe the nuance is more authentic. But I think as an umbrella, it's like it's like the primary colors. Like there's, I don't know that there's something more than that. I mean, like grief, for example, is like a brand,
Hmm.
sadness and of anger. But it's more specific, but I don't think it's necessarily like inauthentic to call it sadness at its most basic form. But going through the training and coming to sadness and meeting it and being willing to be with that again, because it was intended, like there was an intentional holding of that, which I would not have gotten to by myself. I shouldn't say that, but it's slower. um was so cool because I realized it's not as scary as I think. I actually, like, I got sad and I was like, just tears came, and then I was like, oh, all right. Like, and then it just didn't kill me. Like, I think I have sadness association with my 20s and my late teens, when I was more sad then, and I collapsed entirely and kind of like took myself out of my life. I just withdrew. I just didn't participate. And that's what I equate with sadness. And in this case, in 2024, I had sadness and stayed around. So it was almost like a different way of, and I think in any moment we're in, we have a different way of understanding an emotion based on the way that we meet it, or the way that we're able to tolerate it, or our capacity for tolerating it will change our relationship with it.
Hmm.
So there's always, I think, room for expansion of an emotion as far as what we believe it to be, what the story of it is, what it's always represented, or how it's been met before versus how it can be now, because the human range of emotions is appropriate. Like it everything I think does have a place. It's just that there are early conceptualizations of what those things meant. Because for me in my house, sadness was depression and vulnerability. So that wasn't, I don't have good associations with sadness. Um, but I can now. Like I feel like I can develop them now. It can be safer now.
Yeah, and I was gonna, I guess, bring that out, the difference between sadness and depression. Because I think
Mm,
for anybody who sadness is, oh, I really don't want to go near there. I'm going to avoid sadness at all costs. I'd rather, or I feel safer with the other emotions. It could be there's a fear of depression. And then maybe for those of us where anger might feel less safe, and certainly for me, it's a fear of aggression.
right. Yes.
Both of which are certain manifestations and maybe more
Yes.
extreme manifestations
Yes.
with other things in as well. There's other things in depression,
Yeah.
there's other things in aggression
Yes.
beyond the simplicity
Yes.
of the emotion itself. But for me, the times when I enjoy sadness is when it's acute, it's sharp, and then it's felt, and then there's this peace at the other side of it. And I've
Mhm.
had this before when I've recognized I'm feeling sad and I've just surrendered right into it. And even I've cried in sadness before and really enjoyed it.
I can understand that in an acute form,
And
like
that,
where
yeah,
tears are going to come.
yes, yes. But that kind of like low level, I guess low, because I think of sadness as being quite a low energy
Yeah.
emotion. Like it
Yeah.
draws energy away, whereas anger kind of pulls energy in as well.
Yeah. So if the threat of an energy that's lowering feels like you're getting too still, again, that fear of collapsing, then it's like, what is it to tolerate a slowing down, not a collapse, right? Like this is my, hello, this is part of the work for me, right? Is how do I slow down and hang out with something without running from it or fighting it and not freezing in it? That is a skill as far as I'm concerned. And that's where I probably would have used food to keep me going, right? So like if the stillness started to descend, binging and or restricting would have felt like momentum drivers to like not go down to stillness, to stay in the movement, because that's felt like no, like still we're getting slower. No, that's we're gonna die. So let's just go to the food, or the adrenaline of the restriction. I think that's how I've coped with things resembling sadness. It's such a weird thing because it's like it's such a basic emotion. Like it's just this is like kindergarten 101. And it's such a new thing. It's like, oh yeah, like it's sad. I'm sad. Like just to even recognize that I'm sad is newish, unless it's very obvious and acute.
What are your memories of pre your college days as a kid? Your experience of sadness, how you saw it, how you experienced it. What do you remember?
I have two memories coming up. One is in high school, which is when I got very sad. And alone. If I was sad, I was alone, because actually this corresponds to the other memory too, because my mom doesn't do sadness. So she was like, Stephanie, she'd talk me out of it. She'd be like, you don't need to be sad because.
Mm.
And my mom doesn't operate there. So she's like, no, 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 like move away, move away. So she'd be very dismissive. So I would be left, and I picture myself in my bedroom, in my bed, being sad by myself because my mom had no time for it. And it was like silly to her. There was I didn't have the kind of mom that would be like, honey, sitting on my bed with me. She didn't have that softness for sadness. My mom's a good mom in many ways, but this was not her like thing. Um, my dad's my dad could do sadness actually, but I didn't like it because when my dad was sad, I felt like, uh-oh. And I remember the first time I saw my dad sad was when his father died, my grandfather, and I saw him cry. And that was it was the first time I saw him sad about anything because my dad was angry about everything.
Mm.
That moment I remember almost having a fear response. Like dad's crying, like F. like I like and I did leave. I was in my living room when they told us my grandfather had passed and he broke down and I left the room and I went to my room and I busied myself. Like I just cleaned my room, I think. And my brother and my sister sat on his lap and they sobbed at first. And I remember my mom came up um, to kind of check on me. And later she told me, like, she's like, you just checked right out. And my mom was crying. So it's not like she couldn't do sadness. But to me, it's either vulnerable because my dad's like angry. He's the one in charge. He's like leading the ship in this angry way. And then here he is crying. Like it was like this dissonance. And then, or it was the dismissal of sadness to me. So I dealt with sadness by myself by either pushing it away or collapsing into it in a lonely way.
So when you said your mum could rationalize sadness away, she'll give you reasons why you don't need to be sad. You can't do that when someone's just died. Like there is no rationality. It's like the one time, okay, we're all in agreement. We can feel
Yeah.
sad because a human being who we love has left this planet. We're allowed to feel sad,
Yeah.
which of course is going to bring us on to grief. And I want to get there in a moment. But if we were looking at, we take shame, for example, I think the story of shame is I'm not who I'm supposed to be, or there's something wrong with me. It's the story of that emotion. And the story of anger, and feel free to add or correct if you think of it differently, is it's not fair, it's not right. That's kind of the story of
Yeah.
anger. What do you think of as a story of sadness?
Oh, immediately I just want to say there's nothing I can do. But that's helplessness and collapse. So it's probably wrong. Well, it's probably not quite right. And that was my impulsive response. What would it be? Well, it does. It feels like there's nothing I can do.
But that's your reaction to sadness.
I
What is
know.
sad? What is
I can't
sadness?
get there. Like
That's
you tell
interesting.
me. Like I just keep going to my story.
Sadness, as I think of it, I think this would fit most examples of sadness, but I'm kind of processing as I go, is that there's a loss, there's an absence. So sadness for me is intertwined with loss, intertwined with the not having of something.
Hmm.
Something is not there. I feel sad because I don't know, I've hurt my leg and I can't do anything. I have
Mm.
lost my mobility temporarily in that kind of situation, or grief where it's more obvious that it's a loss. But is there sadness where there isn't a loss of something?
Well, I'm thinking about like when I think about sadness in terms of like international news, right? Situations going on in other places that are inherently I don't know that feel it like is a loss there, but to me again it's just because it's like there's nothing we can do to help. There's nothing like these poor people who have I guess they have lost safety, like but is that their sadness or my my sadness when I watch that is something of I can do nothing about that. It
So
keeps coming back to that for me.
yeah, I would think of it more for me with the world things is if we're focusing on oppressors or all of that, then the feeling's going to be anger. When I'm focusing on suffering and what other people don't have that they need, whether it's food or safety, whatever that might be, that for me is like vicarious sadness. It's empathic sadness. Because why else would I
Yes,
be sad
but the
about,
same thing would be said for anger. It's like it's also a reflection of what somebody doesn't have is the injustice of that.
but there has to be injustice for the anger to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas sadness, it could be, I don't know, let's say your grandparent lives to 100, they had an amazing life and they were ready to go and they have like this sort of ideal passing out of this world.
Yeah.
There would be sadness. There's not so likely to be anger
Yeah.
because
Right.
there's a sense of it doesn't feel
Yes.
unjust.
Yes.
The circumstances, everything was done, there isn't regret. There isn't all the other things that can complicate
Yeah.
grief. Then it's
Yes.
sadness.
Yeah. Which, yeah, just the way I'm just even thinking about it, obviously, it's like I will find the place where there's injustice. I'm looking, and
Hmm.
that will help me process the sadness via anger.
Yeah.
In the cases you're talking about where there isn't that injustice, yeah, then it's just you're talking about a loss of something. Those kind I almost can deal with. I can cope with that one. I just can't cope with when maybe, I don't know. This is a little complicated. What does food do for someone like you in sadness? Was it a place where you use it?
I think it was more when I think about the periods of time where my eating felt much more about numbing and emotional soothing. Yes, I felt sad, but I felt more the shame of the collapse more than it felt like about dealing with the sadness. It was
Oh,
how I
okay.
felt about myself that I was stuck in this feeling, not the emotion itself. This is just how it makes sense to me in this moment talking about it.
Yeah.
Because when I let go of the shame of it, or, was letting go of some of the shame of it, then it felt much more okay to allow my emotional experience to feel sad or to feel aloneness or disconnection at time because I didn't then make it mean there was something wrong about me. I'd
Mm.
reduced all these, I should be this, I should be that, I should be all of it. It was much more acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't really like, oh, I don't want to feel sad, so I'm going to eat. It was more the shame about being stuck in a kind of collapse that made me want to eat, I think,
Okay.
as close as I can get to it.
So
Do you
yeah,
think
so
I'd be more likely to eat on anger than sadness any day?
I would eat on anger too, but not for the same reasons that you're describing it with sadness. Like I don't have shame about my anger. So I don't feel bad about it. Like, but I would eat in anger to cope with anger to that would be the regulating. It would be like the food in that moment would be a way of translating that high energy. With sadness, it's this lower energy to begin with
Mm-hmm.
that I would be more likely to push down, I guess, using food because I don't think I ever even touched sadness too much in recent or more like recent decades, but like in my earlier times, like again, when I'm talking about more my teenage years and then those early 20s, where I was more in touch with my sadness as a collapse. And food in those times would be a way of sort of collapsing. I think that I don't understand didn't understand sadness without collapse. Like I just had to make it extreme somehow. And I think that's what food might have done when I was feeling sad. Like it brought me even deeper into some hole where then I would feel like, yes, I just have to lay here now. I don't know I could tolerate sadness on a more just there. Like I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that I could do that.
Well, when
Yeah.
we're talking about slower energy, I've definitely used food to try to speed up my energy or to try to, I think sometimes I'd use it more like a motivation. So sometimes I could have felt so low. And then actually, after I binged, I was able to
Really?
actually get
I've
up and
heard
do
people talk
things.
about that.
Yeah. It's almost like it's out of the way and then I could do it. But I wouldn't, again, it doesn't specifically feel about the sadness itself. And it's also making me think about sadness in terms of food, this concept that we've touched on before. And I've had a couple of requests recently actually about doing more content about it. This idea of grieving the end of a meal
Mm-hmm.
or grieving that the food is finished. Because that's also when I'm thinking of the story of sadness to be something about a loss. It is. It's this how I was enjoying that food or I wanted that food and now it's gone.
Yeah.
Or yeah, now it's gone. And almost the sense of I don't get to eat again for a few hours. And I don't mean that as in, oh, I shouldn't, but that for me
Yeah.
would be a, well, I don't want to wait a few hours. If I finish my meal, there's a sense of I'm not eating again until the next eating
Yeah.
occasion, which isn't
Yeah.
now. Do you relate to that feeling, the grieving the end of a meal?
Again, it would have made me mad. It
Mm,
wouldn't have made me sad. It I can relate to it as far as feeling like almost like it's not fair that I have to
mhm.
stop. But I can't relate to it when it comes to the sadness part.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm only now able to look at sadness and I no longer have sadness when a meal ends. So I'm trying to I can't retroactively apply it. It's like confusing me. Like
Hmm.
I don't know.
Hmm. Hmm.
It would have just made me angry. But I also think, well, why don't I have it now? Like, why isn't there sadness at the end of a meal now? And I think sometimes where food represents a conflation with something else. Like food to me now isn't this thing that I mourn the loss of because I know more is coming another time, but it isn't tied to me with like comfort. It's not, I mean, it is to some degree, but not to a big degree. And it's not tied to like, I have a client who always says like food is my best friend. And I don't have that feeling with it, you know, anymore. So it doesn't feel like a loss.
Hmm.
But I think where food might become an association with comfort, safety, hiding, friendship or whatever, love. then and please feel free to argue that. Like, but is that a part of the reason why one would feel sad at the end of a meal? If there's an association.
Yeah, because I also don't get that feeling anymore. And I think it's because I think of it now, and when I say now, in this very moment, of being more like my appetite just feels more regulated. So let's say I went out for a meal and the food was delicious and then it's finished.
Yeah.
I'm usually feeling pretty satisfied.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be a bit of a sense of not satisfied,
Yes.
certainly for me anyway, for that sadness, the sense
Yes.
of grieving the end of the meal to be there.
Yes. Okay. That makes more sense. So I have a post from years ago that I just spoke to somebody about. It said something like there's a certain kind of desperation that descends when we are physically full but not emotionally finished. So that I could relate to, where it was like I knew I'd eaten enough, quote unquote, but I wasn't done eating bit emotionally. And that again made me mad. But I can think about that when it comes to, I have a client who has this happen on a regular, that's why we were talking about this post, because I was like, oh, there's a post I have about this phenomenon you're describing. And where this is a client who has a lot of grief, past and present. And she said to me the other day, I actually noticed for the first time last night that I was full, but I wanted something. She said, but I realized that what I wanted wasn't more food. And the pulling of this apart, and she said, she's like, so I ended up, I had the clarity of understanding that it wasn't more food that I wanted. So I sat on my couch and I watched a movie under a blanket, and I was just like sad about something. She said I didn't cry or anything like that. It wasn't like I did any processing, but I just had this understanding that there was something else. And I think that's so hard. That I think pulling that apart is so, I don't know that I ever did that myself in it. Like I don't know that I ever knew the difference between when I just wanted some more comfort, or I just wanted some more company or something like that, versus I wanted more food. And probably also that has to do with when you're a binge restrictor, there's a lot more conflation of wanting more food with actual biological instinct towards it. So I think for me, this was very muddy. But
Mhm.
like now, I think I can hear that. I mean, I think I know that difference now, and I can listen to the difference now. But when it's so messy, I think sometimes then maybe it's like, what do we watch out for here? Like, what is the difference between wanting food and wanting, and fill in the blank? Like, what else? What are the other things we may want that food is standing in for in a moment like that?
Well, it's making me think as well. There's an idea with grief and loss that if you lose somebody, it can bring up all the feelings of previous losses. You know how they're all kind of connected like that. And so I wonder that idea of something missing or a loss of something, if like say food related, if there's a lot of grief in your life around that, I wonder how these might
Yeah.
um,
Right.
overlap. And I've shared before, my bulimia was never worse than in the months, the 6, 7 months, 8 months, maybe even about 8 months after my mum died. That was when it was at its very, very worst. And I didn't feel like I was in grief at all
I know.
because I had a full-time eating disorder to contend with instead. It was a very
See
helpful
how that works.
distraction, helpful if, torturous distraction at the time. So I wonder about that as well, like that whole using food, or even it wasn't even just using food, it was using the struggle as somewhere else to put this emotional energy, because it wasn't that I didn't think I should be grieving, but I just didn't feel like it was really there. So I really didn't feel like it was there. And for someone who's
Yes.
relatively safe with sadness and that
Yeah.
this kind of ballpark, I was so out of touch with it. And again, I've shared previously, it was the psychologist saying to me, I don't think that you have grieved for your mum, because when you talk about her, you cry. And I'm like, what?
Mm.
How do you get there? But damn it, she was right.
Everything makes sense in retrospect. But when
Yeah.
you're in it, you're like, no, that is not it.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Also, I mean, because I'm thinking about I would have told you, and there's times I can reflect on too, where I'm like, oh, that time in my life was really sad. No wonder, but in the moment, I promise, like you, that I was like, no, it isn't. I'm not sad about this. In retrospect, like I was. But what was happening was what I was sad about was my body size. And that felt like the only thing that I would have given you. I would have been like, okay, I'm not sad about these relationships dying or whatever, but I am sad that my body looks like this, and that's why I'm eating. That I can understand that I'm running from.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of times what I see happening is that the longer we have conflated a sadness about something with our body image, the more that the body image become like, I think sometimes like when we talk about it, it feels like, oh, you're not sad about your body. You're sad about your mom passing or something like that. And it doesn't ring true sometimes for people because I think at some point the symbol becomes its own it becomes more than a symbol. And then that is the only thing that we can associate with. And I think that that's a very complicated place to be because then my body image did become a symbol. It started as a symbol. It started as a front, I should say. It started as like a coping mechanism, but it did eventually become the symbol and the association of being accepted, really, and being not alone, really. Like, and then it was harder to pull that apart. And I think really like my body image at some points in my life it was a front for feeling lonely because all my friends, I think I've talked about this before, like when my eating disorder started, this was like the coming of age time in adolescence. And my friends were like growing up and I didn't want to. I wanted to stay in like friendship zone. Like I didn't want to have boyfriends and I didn't want to, and all my friends were like getting boyfriends and doing their own things. And I was left in this place of feeling lonely. And my friends were picking their boyfriends over me now. And it was such a lonely feeling. And my parents were also in disarray and like my whole family, like I just was like, it was me, myself, and I during those years. And that's when I started focusing on my body to front all of that. I could never have named all that at the time. I see it now. But then my body did become this symbol of when my body looks a certain way, I do get more attention. The boys then want to talk to me. I guess for family, it didn't really matter. Actually, it did because my parents started getting worried about me. So they would look at my body and be like, something's wrong. That's when my mom started paying more attention. So then my body was the source of something emotional. And it wasn't just a front. And then you go on and on and on in your life and it becomes more and more entangled. So I think sometimes like when we say, oh, is your body image just a front for sadness or is your eating a front for sadness? And people feel like, no, it isn't. It's because in part it has also become something else. We can no longer even connect it back to its original source, where that original entanglement exists, which is tricky. But I think it's helpful for me to think about it like that. Cause I'm like, no, it was related. I can accept it as like a sadness thing, but it also was its own thing. And I wanted that validated too.
When you were talking, part of me was like, is this veer into self-deception territory? If you're adamant something's not going on, but it actually is?
Yeah. In the beginning,
Yeah.
but then not later.
Yeah.
Yes, I am sure. I am. I told you I'm not. I said, I'm sure there's places where I self deceive and I don't have awareness. And that would have been one because I didn't want to be sad.
Yeah.
Plus, to be honest, I was angry. I was mad that my friend, that's what I would have admitted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I wouldn't have admitted that it was sadness. I can only understand that now.
Yeah. Because it's interesting when you were saying, I feel like well, I can't remember the word you used, but basically like I'm helpless. If it's sadness, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. It's so interesting because that's how I feel about anger. It feels so
Huh.
fruitless to me because I feel angry. And then if you speak from that place of anger, again, like this is old stuff as well, but I feel like there's truth in the here and now too. People are less likely to be receptive to what you're saying.
You speak from activation,
Yeah. But
but
even speaking from anger sometimes.
well, that's what I mean by activation. But like not necessarily because I
Mm.
can do that now. I can speak from my trigger. I just wrote a post on this morning. I can speak from my triggered place of anger, not productive.
Mm.
But if I can regulate my anger and then speak from it, I can do that pretty effectively. So I don't think it's true that it depends on your level of activation. that will thwart your message because you're not using your whole brain. But you can speak from a regulated place of anger
Yeah, you're
and
probably
get the
right.
job done. I've done it.
It's really interesting because there's like my body is resisting that. My mind's going, yeah, no, I know that makes sense. But my body's going, no, no, I just don't like I don't believe it from the neck down, but the head up, I'm like, I can't argue with that because it sounds true. Look, if you're gonna
Sounds
make
true.
sense like that, I can't argue with you.
Well, that's advocacy, is really what that is. I don't think advocacy is absent of some level of anger. It's just regulated.
Interesting.
Otherwise, you're speaking from a trigger. And that being triggered and angry is not productive usually.
But can you advocate just because you think it's the right thing to do, but you don't necessarily feel particularly angry
Then
about
you're
it
not
at all?
passionate. And I feel like, well, what use do we have for passion for dispassionate advocates? Like I want my advocate to be passionate.
Fair dues. So how would we talk about this then for the listeners in terms of sadness? How do we approach sadness? What are helpful ways to approach sadness?
I'm just learning. Well, I can tell you, I guess because I'm learning, practicing. So I guess I'm in a position where because I'm in this training and I've been doing it for a while, like I have this space where I'm supposed to be holding and tolerating these rises of sadness, in my case. And because there's someone helping me and supporting me in that, I feel safe enough to keep practicing doing that. So I think that there's something to be said of like a supportive environment for actually being intentional and conscious about an exploration of an emotion that we otherwise feel afraid of, or that's really getting in our way that we're not exploring. Because over time, I feel like I've been able to approach and be in sadness, and I am realizing more and more that I don't die. Like I know that I wasn't going to die, but it doesn't feel like an emotional crash. It actually just feels like something it can wave through. So I don't know that I would have ever been able to tolerate that if I didn't have the opportunity to practice it, sometimes in a safe way, in a contained way. So I am on the side of having support.
I think my offering on sadness is when it feels like sadness is happening to me, that feels much worse than when I feel like I'm moving toward it. So when I recognize, on occasions when I've recognized it's there and I really move towards it and I just make space. For me, it will sometimes come up when I sit down on the yoga mat at the end of the day. So there have been times when instead of doing my yoga practice, I've just sat and had a little cry and it's been
Yeah.
lovely. And for me, the yoga mat is such a safe place to do that because it's such an intentional checking in.
Yes.
And I know I'll get up and I'll get off the mat. And if I feel like doing a bit of yoga after I've had a cry, then I will. But
Yeah.
sometimes the relief of the cry almost makes me feel like I don't need to do the yoga tonight. It feels like
Yeah.
my yoga. So I think that when there's space made and we move towards it, it's like we are choosing to go into it. And that for me feels a bit more empowering. It feels a bit more, it feels safer for me to be the one going, I'm moving towards you, especially with grief. I think sadness is also always a type of grief that it tends to come in waves. I think the fear is if there's something sad and that thing is never going to change, that by feeling it, what's the point of feeling that pain? And I think it comes in waves, and I think it helps us to process and come to terms and reorient losses, whether it's body grief, whether it's grieving. By body grief, I mean like grieving for how your body has changed,
Mm-hmm.
or grieving for a person, or just some sadness about your life of feeling there are things missing within your life.
I like the idea of because almost like I feel like sadness when it's over here, my instinct would be like to go over there. And this is different when you're talking about even getting on the yoga mat of like doing that. I'm turning towards it for those of you listening, like turning towards something versus turning away from something. And that intention is like intentionally looking at something and being with it is like getting on the yoga mat with the intention of meeting what's there, but that you have some control and that like it's almost it's like there's a choice you're making to do that. And that feels different than if sadness just comes and gets you, because I think that's what makes it feel helpless
Mm-hmm.
potentially.
And I think if life is feeling quite sad for you as well, our episode on joy, I think making space to intentionally I say intentionally experience joy. I know we sort of spoke about not turning it into a pursuit as such, but making space for joy as well. Because I guess the danger with any emotion, people who get stuck in bitterness and anger and resentment, people get stuck in the depression and the sadness. And I kind of also want to note that with depression, there could be biochemical, biological things going on, which
Yeah.
isn't about you just getting stuck in an emotion as such. But again, a little bit like we spoke with the joy episode, it was almost at times when we were in it going, I don't want to feel joy because this is terrible. And I want to feel joy
Mm.
in the life that I want to feel it in.
Mm-hmm.
So again, on this note, I'm not sure if this is quite related, but when I moved into my new flat, my dad was just being a pain in the backside. And he just gave me this lecture on message at one point. Because I just made a comment about that I was finding the transition a bit difficult, but I knew it was a good transition for me. And I was very grateful, blah, blah, blah. But I was just having a tough time emotionally with the transition. And he was like, transition, question mark, question mark. Goes on to like rationally lecture me about why it's a good move, which I already know. And
Mm-hmm.
then at the end, he put in capitals, you are being completely irrational. Bearing in mind, it's not like I was crying on his shoulder. I happened to mention that I was having some of these feelings. I wasn't leaning on him for emotional support. And he said, what was he said? You really need to address this and sit down and have a word with yourself. And I was like, my reaction to that, it was big. And then, of course, as the days have gone on and I'm starting to feel more settled, he came around a couple of weeks later. I didn't see him for a couple of weeks after that. I had been very busy, but I also was not feeling inclined to see him with the way I felt like he was being. And he came along. So he was going, so you're feeling more settled now? So is it better now? Is it better now? And I could not admit that I was
Mm.
feeling okay to him
Mm-hmm.
because I know full well he'd be like, see, all she needed was a good talking to. And
Yeah.
then, and I already acknowledged I knew I was going to feel better anyway. But if I told him I was now feeling better, so I was making the most non-committal responses, like, well, I'm just really exhausted at the moment. So like maybe it'll come at some point, like refusing to like acknowledge any positive emotion. And so maybe it could be like that with ourselves sometimes. I think that does fit with what I wanted to say.
Sounds like you got a little angry inside.
Oh, I did. I did.
See, I would have turned to my dad and been like, yeah, I am feeling better, but it is not because we talked. You did not facilitate that. I still stand by every word I said.
He wasn't having a go. I think he would have honestly thought he was helping with that message.
I'm
The
sure.
gentleman. Yeah.
But how did he deal with sadness when you were young? Was he was he
Angry.
good with it?
No,
But
angry.
so he
So
wasn't
he
your
went through
sadness support,
depression
your
and it
mom
got
was.
angry. Oh, how was he with my sadness?
Yes.
Well, this was more, this wasn't really sadness in the transition. So it was more stress. So it was more
All
active.
right.
Like I said, the more active, difficult
Yes, yes.
emotions, less so.
Okay.
The
Gotcha.
sadness, he will have some patience for a bit, reasonable amount of time, but not for a huge amount
So
of
if you'd
time.
said I'm feeling a little sad, although maybe that
Mm.
wasn't what you were feeling. So
Yeah, but if I want the best reaction, I'm not feeling very well. Then my goodness, unlimited kindness and patience and
interesting.
sweetness. Yeah, it is.
That's
Maybe
I want
that's
to go in
why I
another
developed a
direction.
chronic health condition.
Yeah. Dun dun dun.
It has not escaped the possibility.
Yeah. I have
In
one
my
more
mind.
thing that
Yes.
just as a tip for that I find helpful with sadness, but it would go for any emotion, I think, is to recognize any place where we're having black and white thinking about being in that emotion. Because as I'm processing a little bit right now, I'm like, okay, so what are the places where I'm actually, because I was going to say to you, like, where is a place in your life where you have any sadness today or something like that? And I was thinking about, well, how would I answer that question? And there is a place where I can tap into some sadness, but I can do it now. And what I am recognizing is like the reason I can do it is because I can also understand that it doesn't mean that it's not like the extreme, like that I can be sad about something and still hold space for some parts of this relationship are okay, some parts aren't. But it's not like, okay, I can never talk to this person again because there's some sadness in the interactions or something like that. And the holding space for that gray area is helping me be able to look at it because it doesn't mean like this bigger thing that I think before it would have been like if I admit sadness there, like I have to that's going to be the end of the relationship or that's going to be the end of this thing and it's not so.
Well, I'm sad to say goodbye because it's been a very brief. Normally we record for a few hours. We're only meeting for an hour and we haven't seen each other for a couple of weeks. And now I've got to wait
Yeah.
another week to see Steph. And I feel a little sad about that.
Yeah, we haven't met up recently. So we're going to go now and have a little chat.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. See you all. Bye.
Bye.